Good evening, willkommen. Welcome to tonight's lecture of the Oxford Medieval Studies program, which is on an unusual day for the usual Oxford Medieval Studies lecture, because we wanted it to coincide with a special event, which is Nigel Palmer's 70th birthday. So we are very pleased to have one of Nigel's pupils today giving the Oxford Medieval Studies lecture, and he'll be introduced in a minute by Almut Surbaum, but I've been asked to read out the fire evacuation procedure, which only comes into play when there is a really good crowd in the hall. And I'm very pleased, I'd never had the opportunity before to read out that we have drawn such a crowd to warrant this procedure. So here you go. In the event of the fire alarm sounding, visitors seating in the ground floor, the fire exits are located at the back of the room, to the left and to the right. Visitors seated in the balcony, the fire exit is to your right. Follow the green arrows to the ground floor fire door and turn right in the corridor, leaving by the fire doors at the end of the corridor. The fire assembly point is located at the Ashmolean Museum forecourt, which is over there, where everyone should congregate and wait for the all clear before re-entering the building. Thank you.
This is a very special occasion, and we're sure the sparks will fly intellectually, if not in reality. We will honour Nigel Palmer, and I think we all just say a very happy birthday at the start of these proceedings. Perhaps we could just do that now. And as you will know, the proceedings will take several stages and we'll move from one to the next. But it seemed right and appropriate to start with a lecture, and it's a great pleasure to introduce the lecturer, Stephen Mossman. Stephen, of course, is no stranger to Oxford. This is where he started his academic career with an undergraduate course in German and history, but most importantly, with a dissertation supervised by Nigel on Marquard von Lindau, a figure very close to Nigel's heart. The thesis turned into a book which really put Marquard von Lindau and late German devotional culture on the European map, proving quite what the network was, which a figure that many people hadn't heard of before was in a European connection. And Stephen points out and illustrates that Marquard von Lindau possibly is the most widely read German language author before the Reformation. No mean figure, and one whom he brings to life in his book, in his context and his contextualization. And it's no accident that someone like Caroline Walker-Bynum wrote a rave review of that book. Stephen has published widely on a range of topics, from an interest in the relationships between East and West, the way in which Islam and Islamic culture is received in the West, but also how the West is seen in the Near East, but more widely on Marquard von Lindau, the way in which religious devotional culture in Germany is networked and connected with a range of European thinkers. And one of the things that connects him to Nigel's interests is that most of his questions are developed from very close study of manuscripts, codicology, and manuscript evidence. And what he does is to tease out from these manuscripts where thoughts come from, who has them, what the context is, and bringing what is in these manuscripts to life so that we can see an intellectual context. One of the areas of particular interest to Stephen has been a series of publications on Strasbourg, again, a place that sits on a European intellectual map, part of a German language publication culture, and at the same time networked along the Rhine, both northwards and upwards, but also west and east. And Strasbourg was the topic of a conference which he and Nigel co-organised a few years ago in Manchester. You all know the volume that arose out of that, Lesen und Schreiben in der Stadt. And in that sense, his interests are particularly suited to giving this lecture because they match so closely with those of Nigel. And what we see is someone who is technically part of a German department and someone who's technically part of a history department really coming together in their interests on German historical networks and literary networks in their historical context. It's an elective affinity that is clear from their interests. It was very obvious to taxi drivers in Freiburg, and it's something that I think makes it very enjoyable and a great pleasure. There couldn't be a more suitable speaker, and I think we're all excited to hear about late devotional culture in Strasbourg. Thank you very much, Stephen, and welcome.
Thank you, Almut. I am honoured by your kind introduction and indeed by the invitation to speak in honour of Nigel's 70th birthday here this evening, and to give a lecture standing here in this particular room where I heard my first undergraduate lecture almost exactly 20 years ago. I was sitting down there on the left-hand side. Strasbourg, the city at the crossroads, was one of the great urban centres north of the Alps in the later Middle Ages. The spire of its north tower, erected to its full height in 1439, and which you see here in the famous engraving from the Weltchronik of Hartmann Schädel, remained the tallest building in the world until the 1870s, when the cathedral spires in Ulm, Hamburg and Cologne were confected in conscious imitation in the triumphalist age of German unification. Medieval Strasbourg was a politically conscious city. The decisive victory of Strasbourgeois forces at the Battle of Hausbergen in 1262 liberated the city permanently, not just from episcopal rule, but from its surrounding rural nobility as well. Captured almost to a man, the subsequent ransom of the aristocracy involved their expulsion from the city and financial expropriation. The Republican cast of mind was as entrenched in late medieval Strasbourg as in any of the Italian city-states, and proved remarkably durable. The moderate, cautious and processual introduction of the Reformation in Strasbourg in the course of the 16th century likely owed much to its civic traditions of political discourse. It was also a culturally precocious city, outstandingly productive in this respect, even in the wake of the plague. The famous chronicle of Jakob Twinger von Königshofen, written towards the end of the 14th century, narrated the entirety of history from a Strasbourgeois perspective, starting with creation. We see here Twinger's epitaph in the collegiate church of St. Thomas. As a literary work, it stands as the earliest monument in the new genre of city chronicles written in the German language, a late medieval phenomenon indicative of a new self-consciousness in the old imperial cities. In the earlier 15th century, the first steps towards the industrialization of book production were taken here in and around Strasbourg, in the form of the systems of distributed production and marketing associated first with the so-called workshop of 1418, and later the atelier of Diebold Lauber in nearby Hagenau. Whilst Lauber sought to rationalize the efficiency of secular manuscript production, it may well have been in Strasbourg that Johannes Gutenberg first experimented with printing before he moved in search of finance to Mainz. By the 1460s, Strasbourg was established as a leading centre of European printing, both with woodblocks and movable type. The first edition of the Bible in German was published here by Johann Mentelin in 1466, and he alone printed the great works of the German courtly romance, most notably his outstanding edition of Wolfram's Parsifal. The literary patrimony of the city was gathered after the French Revolution into the great Bibliothèque de la Ville, which, with around 4,000 manuscripts and many times more early printed books, was in the first rank of French libraries outside Paris. Its complete obliteration by the Prussian army during the incendiary bombardment of Strasbourg in August 1870 was an act of cultural destruction in scale the equal of any more recent. We see what was left here in an early daguerreotype taken by the university professor Charles Whitmer visiting his library. What this means is that the literary, religious, and intellectual history of the city has to be reconstructed from surviving fragments and from archival sources unsuited to answering the questions that we would want to pose. In that lies both the difficulty, but also the engaging intellectual challenge of the enterprise. The kinds of sources that survive encourage the pursuit of the religious culture of the city as much as the study of social history as of its literary output. There is, however, an inherent methodological problem with this dual approach. The literary monuments that do survive, and that attest at times to remarkable intellectual creativity and significant innovation, rarely allow themselves to be located with any precision in a known historical context. We have instead to explore the structures that might account for the surviving material culture of late medieval belief in this city in a manner sufficiently concrete so as to have convincing explanatory potential, without pressing those connections we establish beyond the weight that the circumstantial evidence will bear. Let me now turn to a particular example, one of real significance for the devotional culture of late medieval Strasbourg. The works of the Dutch religious writer Jan van Ruysbroek, here he is, one of the outstanding voices of the Christian spiritual tradition, were transmitted during Ruysbroek's lifetime in roughly equal measure in their Dutch original in Brabant and in German translation. The circulation of this early German translation of Ruysbroek's works at a very early point in Ruysbroek's literary career was restricted to the German southwest and is intimately connected to the city of Strasbourg. This was as early as 1350, when Ruysbroek's Augustinian community at Groenendaal in the Zonian forest south of Brussels, which would produce manuscripts like this one here much later, was only at the time newly founded, and Ruysbroek's reputation still essentially a local Brabantine affair. That is remarkable because it is something that we see in Strasbourg and the upper Rhineland around it, but outside of Brabant, otherwise nowhere in Europe until the very end of the 14th century, when Geert Grote had translated some of Ruysbroek's works into Latin. Now, it is not the case that the texts written by Ruysbroek passed slowly upriver, moving from point to point, arriving in Strasbourg rather later than in Mainz, and having arrived in Mainz rather later than in Cologne, and so on. Instead, these works are to be found simultaneously in Brabant and on the Upper Rhineland, and otherwise not at all, not in between. Now, this direct connection between these two places, two regions, is illustrated by two Dutch manuscripts that have attracted much attention in recent years. One with the earliest surviving copy of Ruysbroek's Berichten der Verklaringen, the booklet of clarification, in the sense of explanation, which is very possibly the actual manuscript from which the translation of that work into an Upper Rhenish dialect of German was made. Between their production in the southern Low Countries and their documented reception into the library of the Augustinian convent of the Ruhkloster around 1400, some of their parts had travelled a long way. For they bear annotations, as you see here at lower right, and additions, as you see here at top left, in the upper Rhenish dialect of Strasbourg and its environs. The multiplicity of contributory German hands to these Dutch language manuscripts makes it certain that it was these booklets which travelled from the Low Countries to an upper Rhenish religious community and then back again, and rules out the possibility of a German active in a Dutch community that we might assume were we dealing with one annotating hand. We have no actual evidence as to where these Dutch manuscripts were produced. It cannot have been in their subsequent home of the Ruhkloster, because this was not even founded until 1374, and the manuscripts are much older. Nor do we know for certain where they were sent in or around Strasbourg. In older as in recent scholarship, however, there is no hesitation to hold the Friends of God responsible, both for the translation of Ruysbroek's works into German and the annotation and augmentation of these Dutch manuscripts. The Friends of God are said to have been a shadowy religious movement, crucial to the transmission and reception of vernacular religious literature in the late medieval Rhineland, with the Strasbourg financier and mystical writer Roelman Merswin and the Dominican preacher Johannes Tauler as its leaders. I don't wish to overstate this, but it is at best unfortunate that the one thing of which we can be absolutely certain about the Friends of God is that they did not exist. They are a myth, persistent in the scholarship precisely because the very absence of any positive evidence to define them makes them infinitely malleable to explain the origin of material survivals, such as these Dutch manuscripts with German annotations, which otherwise resist easy contextualization. And therefore, one of the things we now know about the Friends of God is that they were fluent in Dutch. Yet there was a religious movement that spread along the Rhineland during the 14th century. It is one that built libraries accessible to outsiders, one in which vernacular literature is known to have held a high status, one whose members were unusually mobile, and for whom book production was a central part of their religious and regular lives, one with close ties to the urban elites of the Rhenish cities, and with known personal and literary connections to Jan van Ruysbroek. It is one that we can document precisely and exactly, one which, unlike the putative Friends of God, left clear traces in the material record. It is a movement that rarely features on the scholarly radar, but one that John van Engen has described as a vital component in the late medieval reinvigoration of the contemplative life, in his vision a concrete part of the second revolution in medieval religious life, the first being the coming of the friars. And this is the rise of the Carthusian order as an urban phenomenon. At the start of the 14th century, there had been no Carthusian presence at all in the Dutch-speaking Low Countries or the Rhineland. But by 1400, there were 20 Charterhouses along the length of the Rhine, from the Delta all the way to Basel and even Bern. Those last two, Basel and Bern, were founded from Strasbourg, itself a foundation of the 1330s, which had in turn, like all the other German Charterhouses in the central and upper Rhineland apart from Mainz, been founded by Carthusians from the southern Low Countries. The senior posts in the Strasbourg Charterhouse continued to be staffed for the duration of the 14th century by monks sent from the Low Countries or northern Germany. Amongst them were intellectual and literary heavyweights. The most well-known are Ludolf of Saxony, author of a monumental Life of Christ, who was sent to Strasbourg to advance to full profession there in 1340, and Geert Grote's a long-standing friend and correspondent, Heinrich Eger von Kalkar, who was appointed to Strasbourg to serve as prior in 1384 and remained prior for 12 years. The spread of charter houses throughout the Rhenish cities across the 14th century marks a significant change in the nature of urban spirituality, especially given the contemplative focus of the Carthusian life. Carthusian monks were expected to build their lives away from their areas of origin, so that they couldn't remain attached to their families, and this is why Ludolf was sent from somewhere in distant Saxony all the way to Strasbourg to profess. But the charter houses themselves, that were founded in the late medieval Rhineland, were intimately connected to the cities in or near which they were located, because they offered now several different forms of association, besides that of the fully professed monk. These now included a novel category of donati, persons who had given themselves as lay associates to the order, alongside other prebendarii and hospites, resident for shorter periods, all with differing levels of access to the formal structures of the Carthusian monastic life. Geert Grote, the founding father, as it were, of the Devotio Moderna, was such a prebendarius when he gave up his clerical legal career to spend several years in retreat at the Charterhouse of Monnickhusen outside the town of Arnhem in the 1370s. The Strasbourg Charterhouse, which was a large establishment with 18 houses for professed monks by 1400, we recall that Carthusians all lived in separate houses. They got one house each. The Strasbourg Charterhouse knew all of these forms of association. The ties between Charterhouse and city were unusually close in Strasbourg because it was founded without the aid of a significant noble patron and had been reliant from the outset on large-scale donations and other forms of support, especially legal support, derived from the citizens of Strasbourg. I haven't switched the image yet because the Charterhouse was unfortunately demolished in the late 15th century, and so we do not know what it looked like. But we do know that what those who entered it would first have seen, fixed in stone, they would have seen the example of a Carthusian, probably Bruno, engaged in contemplative reading. Now, it is well known, at least to me, I always wonder when I begin with these sorts of statements, I think, yes, this is one of those times, Stephen, when no one else will know this quite as well. It is known that it was the Carthusians at Herne who were responsible for the early circulation of Ruysbroek's works. They even secured a text he had not intended for public consumption by bribing the scribe in Brussels to whom he routinely contracted copying work. He was very angry when he found out about this. There is no proof that it was Carthusians who brought Ruysbroek's works to Strasbourg and translated them into German, let alone that any of the surviving manuscripts might be Carthusian products. These are things we simply can never know. But it is the Carthusians whom we can document as a potential transfer mechanism in the mid-14th century, and a new development in the urban spirituality in the upper Rhineland in this same period, quite unlike the alleged friends of God, whom we cannot document at all. Around a century later, it would be amongst the associates of the Strasbourg Charterhouse that the remarkable literary achievement of the prayerbook of Ursula Begerin was accomplished, to which Nigel Palmer has dedicated an, if I may say so, equally remarkable study, which we celebrate tonight. Of particular note is Nigel's observation that the distinctive theological cast given to the meditation on the life of Christ in this prayer cycle, I quote here, fits extremely well into the Carthusian spirituality, with its links to the developments in the religious life that are attested for the Low Countries and the Lower Rhine, in the world of the Devotio Moderna, and which we must suppose travelled upstream to Strasbourg with the Carthusians. Now, it would be the library of the Strasbourg Charterhouse that would shed light onto these hypotheses and suppositions about the significance of the Carthusian network for the transmission along the Rhineland and the production of religious literature in close engagement with the laity of the city of Strasbourg in the later Middle Ages. Whether that is in the mid-14th century, in the case of Ruysbroek's works, or in the later 15th century, with the textual and intellectual foundations of the Begerin prayerbook. We can substantiate these hypotheses to a certain extent with comparative studies of other Rhenish charterhouses from which there is a greater level of material survival, and with certain fragmentary indicators. But ultimately, we are confronted by the near-complete absence of material survival by the from the Strasbourg Carthusian Library. Anything that had not been lost in the Revolution was destroyed in 1870. A book list survives from 1591, not a library catalogue, but a book list drawn up for sale, compiled after the dissolution, or for valuation rather, compiled after the dissolution of the Charterhouse, but it is not very instructive. The absence of any choir books or any works by Ludolf of Saxony, the most prominent Strasbourg Carthusian, are clear indicators that what was listed here in 1591 was only a fraction of the medieval collection. Above all, to quote Nigel Palmer once again, what is wanting in these lists is the large body of late medieval paper manuscripts, which one might expect on the basis of comparison with what has survived from the charter houses in Basel, Cologne, and Mainz. A manuscript newly acquired by the Bodleian Library in recognition of the scholarly contribution of Nigel Palmer now permits an unexpected insight into this lost library. We have here a paper manuscript of the 15th century, in which is assembled a series of meditational treatises and prayers on the life and passion of Christ, alongside works on the specifically and explicitly Carthusian forms of prayer and contemplation. Happy birthday, Nigel. The foundational stock of texts has been augmented and annotated by a series of subsequent hands, with a sequence of prayers on Christ's wounds, added by a Carthusian famulus named Johannes. That horrible blue thing is PowerPoint, it's not in the manuscript. A famulus, not a full professed monk, but one of a particular category of associate brother, evidently with full access to the Carthusian library. The manuscript belonged to the Strasbourg Charterhouse, as we see from an ownership mark on the first recto, but I do not think it originated there. Rather, the two charters, recycled in the limp parchment Corpert binding, point towards the Charterhouse in Koblenz in the Diocese of Trier. If this manuscript was indeed produced by the Carthusians of Koblenz, then we have here the first documented example of this postulated process of cultural and literary transfer mediated by the Carthusians between the Lower Rhineland and Strasbourg that I have been describing thus far. And the manuscript is in a display case underneath a statue of Goethe, a noted resident of Strasbourg, and can be expected later. Now, at the core of the Strasbourg Library that was destroyed in 1870 was the immense library of the Hospitaler Commandery of the Grüne Wörth, which had likely been one of the two largest and perhaps the finest collection of vernacular German manuscripts to have existed before the Reformation. The other one, which survives to a much greater extent, is that of the Katharinenkloster in Nuremberg. Now, this institution, the Grüne Wörth, had been founded by the financier and mystic Rulman Merswin, nothing to do with the Friends of God, in 1367, and incorporated into the Order of St. John of the Knights Hospitaller 4 years later, in order that it should be able to receive lay associates and offer the devout laity of Strasbourg the opportunity to access the regular structures of the religious life without themselves taking monastic vows. The Strasbourg Charterhouse was primarily a monastic foundation that drew lay associates to it. The Grüne Wörth, established around 30 years later, was principally a foundation established to provide the opportunity for lay association itself, and which recruited priests for that purpose from the Hospitallers. The Grüne Wörth library may be gone, but its archive survives intact, and it is in the archival record that it is possible to find evidence of the lives of these lay associates who bridged the gap between the city and the cloister. Different levels of associate can be observed, from those who entered the greater confraternity and actually took up residence in the Grüne Wörth, through more temporary residents who paid pro rata for their board and lodging without entering into a contractual relationship with the Order of St. John, to those of the lesser confraternity who lived in the city and paid a small annual subscription to participate in the spiritual benefits of the order, and if they could wangle it, in its legal immunities as well. My focus in what follows is on the people of the greater confraternity who gave themselves, se donare, to use the formulation of the civic charters by which they contracted their entrance, with all of their properties, into the Grüne Wörth, though they most certainly did not relinquish their incomes or their possessions upon entrance. It is possible to identify in the archives and trace the lives of around 30 such individuals in the first 50 years after the foundation of the Grüne Wörth. To begin with a few general observations, rather than give you 30 sets of charter documentation, they were predominantly women, about 60-40 in percent terms. Married couples were not exceptional. Several individuals were extraordinarily rich, though most were not quite that rich. But only one was of obviously low social status, and she had formerly been the servant of another one. Almost all of the lay associates held the formal status of knights or burghers, kives. There were almost none from the social strata associated with the guilds, and there is more broadly no evidence of any links whatsoever between the Grüne Wörth and the guilds. This was an institution of the burghers, those who held the formal status of citizen, and to a slightly lesser extent, the urban knightly nobility. Now, this phenomenon of lay association with the Grüne Wörth, and more broadly in the late medieval Rhineland, in the Charterhouses, is hard to explain from the documentary record alone. The charters of self-donation give little indication of underlying motivations beyond the formulaic statements in which the postulant expresses a general concern for salvation. It is rare that they offer anything more substantive. for a small number of the super-rich who did enough with their money to leave a significant archival record, we can document their active pursuits after they entered the Grunewald. In one case, to found a hospital, it's the building top left. In another, to pursue entrance into the Order of St. John as a priest brother, despite the subtle impediment of being married to a living wife. In another case, to cultivate the particular virtue of obedience. In a third case, and the desire to undertake those pursuits might plausibly be understood to have motivated their entry in the first place. But all of those cases are particular to the individuals concerned. All of these had enough money to secure what their aims, and there was only one person who was married and decided to become a priest. None offer an explanation of the wider phenomenon. And I think that explanation has to depend on an understanding of change in the lived experience of religious devotion in the urban centres of the Rhineland and the Low Countries in the later Middle Ages. Now, the emergent popularity of intimate forms of lay association with urban monasteries in the late medieval Rhineland is a development associated hitherto with the Carthusians. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the Carthusians had been rigidly opposed to confraternity and other formalized interactions with lay society, like the inscription of benefactors' names into libri vitae, which was not to happen, and the celebration of anniversary masses for those outside their order, also something not to happen. This changed markedly with the revitalization of the cadre of Donati from around 1340. Donati had been strictly controlled, and other associates had been kept to the bare minimum by Carthusian legislation in the 12th and 13th century to separate the rural charter houses from interaction with the lay world around them. But in the later Middle Ages, these Donati, who wore secular dress but were meant to live without personal property, had the conditions under which they lived regulated by a series of ever more generous statutory legislation, including the permissions and eventually requirements to participate in the divine office and the ways in which they could obtain burial as Carthusians. The charter evidence, meanwhile, indicates that this model was sufficiently flexible to allow significant latitude to the individual donatus in the shaping of his religious life. The new wave of Carthusian donati was a feature of the new wave of urban and suburban Carthusian foundations in the later Middle Ages. It was almost exclusively in the Rhenish and Netherlandish charter houses, which formed a major geographical concentration of the late medieval Carthusian revival, that these new donati were found. The late medieval Carthusian model of lay association developed in the Rhineland proved influential. Carthusian statutes directly underpinned or influenced the subsequent regulation of donati introduced into other reformist orders and religious movements in the earlier 15th century. The Grunewald stands out from all of that on account of its precocity. The Hospitallers had existing statutes for the reception of confrères, co-brothers, which made their order an attractive destination into which to incorporate the Grunewald. Yet in practice, the confrères and consoeurs at the Grunewald had nothing in common with earlier generations of Hospitaller lay associates. It is quite possible that the model of the Carthusian donatus served as the inspiration for the lay integration into the structures of monastic life that Roman Merswin envisaged here. His uncle Jakob, after all, had been one of the prominent founding donors to endow the Strasbourg Charterhouse. But the readiness to accept the status of a Carthusian donatus in the later Middle Ages, however, has been explained only very tentatively. In 2014, Tom Garns argued that the introduction of donati enabled reform-minded convents and congregations to profile themselves with what he calls a reformist identity, and stated laconically that the status of donatus, and I quote, appealed to something which is often called late medieval lay piety, such that the strict division between religion, i.e. the monastery, and the world was hence not removed, but pious lay men and women were rather pulled into religion. The implication here that the driving force of change came from within the religious orders is subsequently reinforced by Garns' speculation that the lay piety of the later Middle Ages was potentially, I quote again, something which predominantly took place within the walls of religious communities by their members rather than in private homes. It is the Grüne Wort, above all, which puts the lie to that excessively, in my view, excessively conservative view of the Ordenshistoriker. It is simply beyond doubt here that the impetus to secure lay association with this urban monastery, one of the first locations in which the practice can be witnessed on such a scale in the late medieval Rhineland, was driven by laity, by Roman Merswin and his associates, who pulled their chosen religious, the Hospitallers, who provided a legal framework to permit lay association to a monastic institution, into the city. The early chronicler of the Grüne Wort, Nicolaus von Leuven, indeed argued pointedly in the 1390s that the root cause of monastic decline was the absence of external oversight of monasteries by lay authorities, a problem that the Grüne Wort would not experience, he said, with its board of 3 secular governors to guarantee that the priests maintained a rigorous internal standard of religious life. Was this then a new wave of flight from the world, like that of the friars in the early 13th century? The friars' rejection of secular values in the context of rapid urbanization is understood conventionally and rightly as a consequence of a new commercial mentality and the conspicuous consumption associated with it, which stood ill at ease in the minds of many with the large-scale urban poverty that was its essential concomitant. St. Francis, the son of a cloth merchant, had literally stripped himself of his secular attachment in flight from the world. Here he is. And Giotto literally cleft the architectural backdrop of Assisi in two to divide the world and religion in his depiction of this famous scene. Assisi is not really in 2 parts. The friars, of course, did not simply reject the towns. They were thoroughly imbued by that commercial mentality in their own religiosity and sought to revalorize the city as a place in which a life lived according to Christian values might be led and salvation sought. Now, none of this was new in the mid-14th century. A city like Strasbourg had been the object of intensive mendicant preaching for a century and a half by Ruhlmann's day, and its revalorization had been a great success. In the vita of the Franciscan tertiary Gertrud von Ortenberg, who died in 1335, Strasbourg is the geographical focus of the profound longing for spiritual fulfillment experienced by Gertrud and her companion Heilke von Stauffenberg when they are in the Ortenau, a rural region on the opposite bank of the Rhine. Strasbourg is a city that they say is literally full of grace, to which they move in pursuit of a life closely entwined with the possibilities for theological discourse and devotional ritual that its many religious institutions offered. And in the early 14th century, the culture of mystical contemplation, hitherto associated with rural monasteries, became embedded in the urban environment of the Rhenish cities. It is simply not possible to explain the new phenomenon of lay association with urban monasteries in the later 14th and 15th centuries by reference to the same paradigms of flight from the world, of a division between world and religion, applied to explain the evangelical revivalism of the friars during the first phase of medieval European urbanization. What I would argue had changed, not produced by, the new wave of urban Carthusian foundations, and above all the Grüne Welt, was the nature of urban domesticity itself. It is just not right to think, as Tom Gans and others have done, that a strict division existed between secular and sacred space in the late medieval cities of the Rhineland. That, I would say, pointedly, is an anachronistic imposition of modern structures of life and thought onto the later Middle Ages. It might be truer of the early 13th century with the coming of the friars, but it's not true now. Or then, at least. Now, I take my inspiration here from the anthropologically informed study undertaken by the archaeologist Francis Pryor of a period about as far from 14th century Strasbourg as one could hope to get. His study of the structuring forces of religion and ritual in domestic life in the end of the Stone Age. Because here, and I use this also because it's a very good example by which you can see the analogy. Here, at the end of the late Neolithic, it is possible to observe a shift from large ritual complexes distant from settlements like Stonehenge. See, we all know what Stonehenge looks like. Those stop being built, and instead we find a proliferation, or archaeologists find a proliferation of smaller sites of ritual observance in or adjacent to settlements. And this is called the new domestic order of the early Iron Age. And Pryor argues that this shift is explicable not as a consequence of religion having any less significance in contemporary minds, but as a relocation of ritual practice closer to home, within the communities in which it was needed to cope with the increasing complexity of a society undergoing profound demographic, economic, and social change. It was not imposed from without or above, but was driven by the communities themselves. And in an aside, Pryor suggested very cautiously, one might think about this as his analogy is the early Reformation in Germany. I would say it's rather earlier than that, but I find that a useful model to think about. Now, the study of domestic religious culture in late medieval towns is very much in its infancy. We find many, many books on monsters, but very, very few on homes. It is rarely conducted with regard to change over time, beyond the recognition of the broad chronological framework of the medieval urban world from the 1150s to the 1520s. Within that period, it is recognised that a distinctive material culture of domestic religious devotion existed, as the recent work of Roberta Gilchrist in particular has demonstrated. There is broad agreement that the boundary between sacred and domestic space in the Middle Ages was indistinct. But what emerges from the existing studies of domestic devotional culture only implicitly, if at all, is its intensification, specifically in the later Middle Ages. And that intensification must, I think, be linked to the rise of a new understanding of domesticity itself in the course of the 14th century. It is just that which has been observed by Felicity Riddy in her study of English towns, where domesticity as a state of mind, in her words, was associated with a particular social stratum and so she calls it bourgeois domesticity, like bourgeois but without the O. This may be understood as a set of values associated with those who now lived in increasingly comfortable houses with multiple rooms built on more than one floor, accommodating the household, a word which in English appears first in the 14th century, for purposes of residence and work, houses like these. That allowed for the differentiation of activity by space and time of day. Houses with multiple rooms enabled time to be managed, order kept, privacy created, guests entertained separately, and activities brought inside that for the poor remained external or communal, like cooking or using the privy. Bourgeois domesticity was only in part the consequence of an obvious preference for more spacious living. We all want to live in larger rooms. But also of a change in mentality, the rise of, in Riddy's words, the way of life that sets a value on orderliness and differentiation. It was also a way of life that set a value on privacy, not merely as a mental concept, but as a principle that could be defended in law. Riddy notes that the Assize of Nuisance in London began to encounter cases concerning the right of residents to privacy, a term which appears for the first time and is indistinct in its meaning, from around 1340. As neighbours could now be taken to court for example, breaking open window slots that looked directly into other people's private spaces, or for building wooden structures in their gardens which enabled them to look directly into other people's houses. These cases of nosy neighbours, which became a real problem in the later medieval English towns, represent the process by which the private sphere, the idea of privacy itself, was first conceptualized and contested. Now, I would say that the intensification of domestic religious culture must be a component of this type of domesticity that emerges in the course of the 14th century, although it isn't one that Riddy mentions in her study of England. Let me put some flesh on that thin contention. I have another "it is well known" here. I think this one really is well known, that the so-called privatization of late medieval religious culture and its insistence on interiority reached its apogee in the famous Flemish art of the domestic interior. The location, above all, of the Annunciation to Mary within a recognisably domestic interior is an innovation associated with Robert Campen and Roger van der Weyden in Tournai in the 1420s. When the Annunciation was first set within a realistic domestic interior, as in Campen's famous Merode altarpiece of around 1430, Mary is life-size, and she and Joseph operate as human figures within a thoroughly secular space. You can see the town outside. Joseph is doing some carpentry. Some other people on the left are actually looking in to the house, and it looks inside like a house. Thereafter, this iconography was extended to other scenes, like Mary giving Christ a bath, warming him by the fireside, or feeding him soup. These images it became widespread in Netherlandish art in the mid-15th century, and only really faint halos around the Virgin and Child allow one to recognise that these are, in fact, religious scenes at all. It had become possible to conceptualise the Holy Family within a domestic setting, and that, I think, speaks a great deal to the sacralisation of domesticity in our period, to the bringing of devotional culture inside the house, mentally as well as actually. Domestic space in the late medieval town became thoroughly and inseparably infused with spiritual meaning. Now, this iconography of the domestic annunciation was regionally specific. It is pretty much the norm in later 15th century Dutch and Flemish representations of the Annunciation in books of hours, but it is very rare in French examples, in which the scene is usually set in a church. Mary is larger than life size, there are lots of angels where there should be some canons, and so we are instructed when we see this image, we must interpret Mary symbolically as the embodiment of the church. It isn't an iconography known in England at all until well into the 16th century. But there is one place in Europe where this iconography and the new regard for naturalistically observed domestic interiors associated with Campion and his Flemish circle around 1430 was adopted immediately. And this was naturally Strasbourg. Here, Strasbourg, a panel painting of Joseph's Doubt, very unusual motif, by the so-called Meister des Paradies outlines, part of a great Marian altarpiece, depicts Mary in an interior so fully domestic that were it not for her halo and the small angel at far top right speaking to Joseph, if you think away the halo and think away the small angel, one would be hard-pressed to notice what was sacred about this scene at all. And in contrast to Campion, just look at all the books. The iconography of the domestic Annunciation was well known in Strasbourg and its environs in the second quarter of the 15th century onwards. In fact, these paintings were redated to be younger later because of better datings of the Tournai works. They were previously thought to be even earlier than these dates. The variety of media in which this iconography is presented is striking. In panel painting, that image is obviously enormous, but this is about the same size as a smallish book. Here, the object of private devotion, rather than as a component of an ecclesiastical altarpiece. This example is a Strasbourg product of around 1440. We find it in stained glass, as here on the right, from the Benedictine Abbey of St. Walburga in central Alsace, produced in a Strasbourg atelier in 1461. We find it in tapestry, as here, second along, in an Upper Rhenish woven altar frontal, rather later, from around 1500, in which we find the image as part of a series of scenes from the life of Mary, as in the stained glass window. And perhaps most significantly, we find it in single-sheet metal-cut engraving, a medium that attests to the particularly wide diffusion of this iconography through the medium of print. The engraving here is ascribed to the Meister der Nürnberger Passion, actually an Upper Rhenish artist whose works are sold in Nuremberg. That print survives in a single example, affixed to the rear paste down of a manuscript volume now held amongst the archivalia from the Grüne Wörth. The Strasbourgeois art of the Annunciation, relocated into a domestic interior, is a powerfully graphic illustration, to my eyes at least, of the intensity that the sacralization of domestic space in the city would reach. Our understanding of domestic architecture in Strasbourg has been transformed by the new discipline of the archaeology of the built environment over the past quarter century. It is now possible to identify a pronounced change in the nature of domestic building in Strasbourg that took place around the turn of the 13th century and became the predominant form through into the 15th century. The first major period of medieval urbanization in the city, beginning in the mid-12th century, had seen architectural forms deployed in the towns that were essentially indistinct from those of the country, Massive masonry constructions, some even tower houses, all concentrated in or adjacent to the site of the old Roman castrum with the cathedral at its centre. But the urban residences of the civic patriciate that were built or rebuilt after a devastating fire from the very end of the 13th century, from around 1298 onwards, were quite different, not least in their broader geographical dispersion across the central island of Strasbourg and onto the banks of the far banks of the River Ile beyond. I should have put a map, but Strasbourg is actually an island in the middle of the river. We also see here the much greater density of urban building. No longer a country-style manor house in the great yard, but houses built in courts together. These were townhouses, not rural manors collected together to form a town. Their ground plan is square or rectangular. They have cellars and ground floors of stone, upon which was built 2, 3 full stories, plus up to 4 further attic levels in half-timbered construction. They are surprisingly sober in their external appearance. I'll show you one in a moment. But internally, these residences were much more elaborate. The upper stories could be partitioned into separate rooms using simple post and board walls, which were also much easier because they were not load-bearing or structurally integral to manipulate as necessity dictated, so you could create new spaces inside these houses. The earliest Stuben, wood-panelled rooms heated by tiled stoves, the famous Kachelofen, can be documented from the mid to late 14th century in the German southwest, in Strasbourg from the 1340s, which meant that heated rooms that were not the kitchen, I believe this is a phrase, were now a thing. That means that if you want to be warm in your house, you do not need to be either in the kitchen, where there is a lot going on, or in bed, but in a room that can be separately heated. More modest residences of similar design begin to survive from the early 14th century onwards. But it is the internal decoration with painted walls and ceilings that is amongst the most striking features of this second phase of Strasbourgeois urbanization. The outstanding example is the site now at 17 Rue des Albardes. It is now an Etam shop. I'm not sure what Etam sells. It was comprehensively rebuilt from the ground level up after this whole area was destroyed by fire in 1298. Around 1300, it acquired its present aspect of 2 wooden stories above the masonry ground floor and a cellar, with 3 further attic levels, which you can't really see here very clearly. The ground floor, which was an open space of about 150 square metres, was decorated with floral motifs and had a wood-panelled ceiling. It was likely an aula, a representative room for the reception of guests. The evidence of internal subdivision in the upper stories attests to an internal hierarchy of space that operated vertically, with the level of privacy increasing as the level of public representation decreases as you go upwards through the stories. But in the later 14th century, the ground floor was equipped with new windows, and the interstitial spaces, sorry, that's actually the first floor, was equipped with new windows, and the interstitial spaces were decorated with a remarkable set of life-size depictions of musicians that came to light about 12 years ago when this building was renovated. At the eastern corner, a sacred space was created by a fresco of the adoration of the Magi. So it's now the storeroom, you see, for the shop. So where the boxes are holding whatever it is that Etam sells, it is where the little corner is. And the investigating archaeologist Maxime Verlet thought this corner here likely to be an oratory for private devotion, which could have been panelled off. In the same corner of the building directly above, a series of saints may signal the presence of a second, more intimate and less public space set aside for personal devotion. This vertical hierarchy of the internal organisation of space was thus met by a horizontal hierarchy, which created devotional spaces that were orientated towards one corner of the building, facing onto the courtyard and away from the street. Now, this example is typical of a kind of Strasbourgeois residence built or rebuilt for knightly urban nobles, for those with the official status of citizens, for senior ecclesiastics like cathedral canons, for merchant bankers, of whom there were many in Strasbourg, Mossman was one, and even for wealthier artisans. This is all quite different to the characteristics of late medieval bourgeois domesticity and its architecture uncovered by Felicity Riddy in the towns of England. But I think we should understand it as a parallel development, regionally distinct in its nature, forms and constructional techniques from contemporary urban architecture that you would have encountered west of the Vosges or east of the Black Forest. It is upper Rhenish and peculiarly Strasbourgeois. We have here, in this and other examples in Strasbourg, about 12 have been properly studied so far, of a shared domestic culture of the moneyed residents emergent in Strasbourg around the turn of the 13th century and elaborated in the course of the 14th. It is no coincidence, I think, that the lay associates who entered the Grunewald and the Strasbourg Charterhouse were almost exclusively drawn from these social strata and would have moved from houses of this kind. In this environment, the boundary between the sacred and the secular had become so thin as to become translucent. It was not because the hurdle between the sacred and the secular spheres was rising that so many men, women, and married couples could conceive of the relocation of their homes into urban monasteries in flight from the world. It is because, I think, the hurdle, the gap in the architecture of the town, was barely there anymore at all. Thank you.
Many thanks for a really brilliant overview of devotional culture. I especially enjoyed, I must say, the build-up to the epiphany of the manuscript, which you are now all invited to have a look at. Let Nigel go first, I think. And you're also all invited to drinks, which are now served in room 2. Brilliant, really